After watching some horrifying exposés on the funeral trade on TV, Poppy Mardall decided to launch her own funeral business and revolutionise the industry. She had no experience in the sector, she'd never run her own business, and she'd never seen a dead body. On this episode of Sound Advice Entrepreneurs Unfiltered, Poppy shares her journey from auction house to undertaker and tells us how she's bringing a fresh, modern perspective to end-of-life care. Welcome, Poppy. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Kate. It's lovely to be here.
So, Poppy, take us back. You had this glittering career as Deputy Director at Sotheby's. What made you quit that job to start Poppy's?
I absolutely loved my career at Sotheby's, and like lots of those jobs you get when you're young, you sort of fight quite hard to get it. And I think that's sometimes quite self-perpetuating, that it's competitive and you're lucky to have that job and people keep telling you that. It was really fun. I was cataloguing artwork, so I was mostly kind of working in a basement, taking paintings out of frames and cataloguing sculptures and researching those artworks in libraries, and auctions are great fun. But as the years rolled by, I had this sort of returning feeling that whilst fun, there was some purpose missing. There was some meaning missing for me. And I think it's interesting when you work in a company, you can sort of look around and say, I can see that you guys are really suited here. You start to, I guess it's that tribal thing of like, do I belong? I was having a good time, but the older I got, the more I just felt like I don't think this is my place. It was really a difficult thing to let go because I'd studied art, and again that sense of privilege, such a privileged place to be. But that nagging feeling inside that I needed to follow my own path was becoming kind of louder and louder. And I was funneling it into extracurricular activities. So I started volunteering as I started volunteering as a Samaritan, and I became a volunteer at my local hospice because I think what my brain was doing was saying, it's okay, you could just do that stuff over there. But again, as time went on, I think I just felt like, no, I need to find out what this nagging feeling is and do something about it.
It's really brave to listen to that nagging voice in your head and actually quit a job that you're comfortable in, that you're doing well in, to find something else, especially when you don't know what that something else is. How did you then find purpose and meaning? Like, what led you to set up Poppy's?
Well, reflecting on your question, it's interesting. Like, I was becoming miserable. And I really trust my misery. If I'm feeling miserable on it for a day, that's fine. If I'm ill, that's fine. But if you're feeling that way day after day after day, and you know that something in you is not expressing itself like it used to, I think you do feel sort of compelled to do something about it, or I did. I did that thing lots of people do, where I thought, well, I'll just sort of show up at 9 and leave at 5 and bring a notebook and jot my ideas down. But like lots of kind of dutiful employees, the problem was I was committed to the job while I had the job. So what I started to realize was I'm not going to figure out while I'm here. That took me like 2 years to figure that out. So that wasn't a kind of overnight awakening. And so I basically saved up some money to live off. So the kind of pact I made with myself was like try and save up sort of enough money to live off for 3 months. And that can be a period of time to get creative. And what's interesting looking back is I think the wildest idea I had at that time was really not very wild at all. Because I think that's another problem about trying to think creatively while you're still in the rut you were in, is that your brain just doesn't have the space to think as openly as you need to think in order to really answer that question.
What was the not so wild idea?
Oh, it was like, so I was an expert in 20th century British art, and it was like, maybe I'll set up my own gallery, or like maybe I'll go and work for that gallery. It was, I don't want to speak for other people, but I think for me, it's like you're in this pond and you're on this lily pad, and the lily pad you're on is sort of, I don't know, shrinking or it's not happy. And so you just look to any other lily pad close by and you're like, well, I'll just jump to that lily pad. And I know what would have happened. I would have jumped to that lily pad and then I would have got the same feeling. Probably it would have scratched that itch for a couple of years and I would have got the feeling again. So I'm so glad that things turned out the way they did, even though they were somewhat dramatic.
So you had this 3-month buffer and this plan to work out what you were going to do. What happened next?
I went to Ghana for 5 weeks because I thought that travel for me has always been a really good way to just kind of clear the decks. And there was a real, like, again, I don't know if this speaks to people, but it's really visceral for me. There's something about like being in a certain workplace surrounded by your colleagues, being in your community surrounded by your friends, everything's the same. And for me to think clearly and openly, like all of that has to go. I have to go somewhere else, I have to eat different food, hear different languages. None of those things would be possible now because I've got small children, but again, privileged, late 20s. So I went to Ghana, had an amazing time, spent a few weeks just having fun, but just, again, with a notebook. And then when I got back from Ghana, I got really sick and then found out quite quickly I had typhoid. And then I was ill for I was properly ill for a month. I was in hospital for a few weeks. And then I just took so long to recover. It was sort of 9 months in total before I was back at full strength. So it definitely plan fell apart. And what's interesting is how strongly I now feel that without those 9 months, I would never be working as a funeral director now.
Because it was while lying on the sofa recovering that you started to watch these exposés on the funeral trade. What is it that you found so shocking, and how did you think you could change that industry?
I love the idea of, because I sometimes think when I tell this story, there's this idea of like a 19th century novel that I'm like on the sofa with typhoid, kind of like thinking about death and watching exposes about funeral directors. So the way it sort of happened was I started thinking really broadly. So I was thinking about all moments in life that feel quite democratic and also quite critical. Like, what are those democratic critical moments in life? And birth is obviously another one. Like, what are the things that happen to all of us that really matter? I don't know. Just for me, I was really interested in that. And so death was just one of those ideas. And I was kind of fiddling around with a few at the same time, which again, I think was really helpful. I think it meant there wasn't too much pressure on any one outcome at that time. Yes, as I started to get stronger and I started to recover and I was exploring the world of death very, very like, this would be mad. And this isn't I'm sure I wouldn't end up being a funeral director. I came across, it was like 3 or 4 exposés within the period of sort of 2 or 3 months. It was really bizarre. And all the exposés showed the same thing. So they showed really manipulative sales techniques towards grieving people. So kind of just selling quite hard, selling stuff, not selling good service, but like, how about another limousine? And why not choose this casket rather than that simple wooden coffin? Or, a good amount of sort of like guilt selling. And I found that really repulsive. And also really poor treatment for the dead. So at that point, I didn't have a sense of what good death care would look like. I'd never seen a dead person before and hadn't arranged a funeral. I mean, I'd been to many funerals, but I hadn't arranged one myself. So it was not like I was coming at care for the dead with any strong conviction, but just what I saw, I really disliked. So sort of production line treatment of the body. So people being stored in sort of open metal racking in large warehouses, wrapped in plastic body bags. I think I look back and I think, what was the thing? What was the kind of fire that got lit? And I think for me, there's always something about telling the truth. So, in life, if you're practicing something and you can explain it and you can justify it, most people can sort of get their heads around it. But I really dislike that kind of out front, seemingly caring service when actually what's happening behind the scenes is anything but. Really gets my goat, particularly when the people you're working with are highly vulnerable and can't really do anything about that. So I think it was this combination of never thought about this before. Death happens to absolutely everyone, and bereavement happens to all of us many, many times. This just felt so important, and such horrible things were happening, and also no one seemed to care. And I think the combination, it was like a Venn diagram of like, oh, that's got Poppy Mardall stamped all over it.
So you were propelled ahead partly by anger and shock. But how did you make that transition and learn the trade and make that jump from art expert to funeral director? Where did you start?
One of the things I love about having had a creative training, both in terms of studying art and then working at Sotheby's is I think creative training can free you from thinking that everything needs to be rationally connected. I just didn't have this barrier that said, well, you've been at Sotheby's, now you must. It just didn't, I didn't feel restrained by that. But of course, there was a ton of stuff I didn't know. And really, what I did was I just started really openly reaching out to people and saying, I don't know much about this sector, but I don't like what I see, and these are my skills, and I'd love to get involved. Could we have a conversation? So I wasn't asking for anything at that point more than just a conversation. And I was reaching out to, so there was an amazing man who ran a blog called The Good Funeral Guide called Charles Cowling, who was just very provocative in his criticism of the sector. So, I just asked him for a conversation, and I did that with some non-religious celebrants who work in the sector. So I was sort of picking people who I thought probably already think there's something wrong here, and just offering to come and have a cup of tea and bring them a box of biscuits and talk for sort of 40 minutes. Again, as I talk, I realise how privileged a position I was in to have the time and the freedom to work like that. But it was really helpful because it meant I gained people's trust sort of early on. And one conversation turns into 5 more conversations, and people just kept introducing me to other people. So Charles Cowling, although a very sort of progressive provocateur, had good relationships with some traditional funeral directors who wanted things to change. And so he connected me with a couple of funeral directors who just let me come and spend the time behind the scenes in their mortuaries. To be honest, I don't want to sound arrogant, but I think a lot of what needed to change in the sector meant that there was a lot that I didn't need to learn from the sector. I needed to spend some time with the dead because I needed to figure out whether I could become passionate about care for the dead. Because at that moment, I was passionate about care for the grieving, but I didn't know much about the dead, and I just needed to see if I could get passionate about that. And turns out I could. Because I think one of the misconceptions about mortuary care is there's this idea that everybody who works in a mortuary is sort of like obsessed with fetishizing the body, and like you think of sort of mortuary makeup and lace trimmed coffins. And actually, my opinion is like great death care is treating that person who's died as if they were alive, as in they're an individual, and you need to find out what care they would have liked to have received, and you find that out from their family. And so I could get really passionate about that, treating people like people. And so I just went step by step, meeting one person after another, asking for small favors, being charming, not being afraid to kind of hustle and see if I would go and work for a day for free at a funeral director's, and I'd send a nice card afterwards. I'd send some chocolate. I think these small things are really easily overlooked. People respond really well to you being a charming human being. The old skills still work now.
And how long did you spend in that period of listening and learning before you took the leap and launched Poppies?
Yeah, not long. And in retrospect, that was such a sign. I'm so glad I did it that way, but I would be terrified to do it that way now. The naivety and the confidence that comes at that time in your life. But yeah, it was probably 3 months once I'd really started meeting people. So the second funeral directors I went and spent about a month with in their mortuary, and my plans were coming together quite fast. So at that stage, I was crystallizing a sense of I want to provide a service. I don't want to just be kind of another advisor, or I want to be providing the service myself. And how will I do that? Because you need stretchers and vehicles and fridges, and I don't know the first clue about all the paperwork that's involved. And so what I decided was, let's just take one service that is poorly provided now. And so the service I picked is now known as direct cremation. We called it simple cremation at the time. And basically it's having a cremation with no ceremony, very, very affordably. So it's collecting the person who's died, caring for them as beautifully as you would care for anyone else, simple coffin, bringing them to the crematorium in a simple vehicle. And we allowed and encouraged family to come to wave them off if they wanted to, but there was no ceremony. So it meant we could offer the service very, very affordably. Also, crematoria often offer much more affordable rates early in the morning, and so we kind of would have 9 o'clock sessions, which meant it could be done affordably. And so where that was clever is it just it stopped me from feeling overwhelmed. It was like, okay, I can provide this. This is the paperwork I need for this. This is how much I'm going to charge. It's just one fixed price. I visited all clients at home, so I didn't need any meeting rooms, and it felt like a very personal service in a sector that rarely does that. Other funeral directors weren't offering this service, so from the very early days, we got quite busy. But all of that was crystallizing when I was spending time with these funeral directors, and I was talking quite openly with them about my plans, and they said, "Why don't you start by doing it from here?" And so that's what I did for the first, I think, 3 or 4 months, is I used their mortuary and I worked with their team. So when someone died in the night, I would go out with their team in their vehicle and bring the person back to their mortuary, and we'd go out on the on the day of the funeral together. And that didn't last very long, but it was the lucky break I needed to just kind of get me over the line.
And you started out with that one quite simple service, really focusing in on that. How did you then go about expanding the business? What were some of those early challenges you faced, especially as a woman in a very male-dominated industry?
Our very first client called and said, "You look lovely. I definitely want you to look after me and my husband who's dying, but I don't want a simple cremation. Can you help?" And so from the very early days, that was a brilliant way that we grew, was just like case by case basis, like, yeah, sure, I can do that, And because I was never passionate about simple cremation, it was just something I felt like I could cope with at the time. So I really highly recommend that as a way to grow, which is like, tell people what you can do and then listen to other requests as they come in one by one. I have to be grateful to my gender for what it has given me in terms of how quickly we stood out from the crowd. Because Poppies is not only founded by me, but it's also called Poppies. It's a woman's name. It's also a flower. None of these things are synonymous with the kind of like big black cars and men marching around in top hats that you think of with the sector. We got a lot of press early on, and we had quite a lot of fans early on within. So maybe like a coroner's officer or a hospice palliative care nurse might make contact and say, like, it's so refreshing to see like a young woman shaking things up. I'm going to tell people about you. So certainly my being female has given me a platform that I think I wouldn't have had I been a kind of white 50-year-old man. I don't think I've had, because that's one of the reasons why I became a funeral director, was I didn't want to have a role in the sector where I had to get permission from the men in order to be able to do my work. That if I'd become a celebrant or if I'd become a sort of advisor, I would have had to get my business from funeral directors. And so the whole point about becoming a funeral director was like, I'm just going to speak directly to the public. And women have been caring for the dead in our communities since the dawn of time. Funeral directors are a very, very recent invention. Like midwives, it's largely been women's work. So, I had some really kind of hilarious and bizarre experiences. Like I remember going and speaking to a coroner's officer about the service that I was launching, and he was nice to me. He wasn't saying this, he wasn't threatening me, but at some point he said, like, you should sort of like watch your back. And there was some, the funeral sector is a strange world, but there was some strange kind of veiled kind of threatening language used at times, funeral directors occasionally. But again, the power of providing your service directly to the public means you don't have to kind of bow to that. I'm not trying to skip this question, because I'm sure there are things. I think I have to say, I grew up in a family that really made me feel like I could do, that the world was something that I could shake up. And so I've always had that in me. And I think the times where my gender or sex has been used against me, I just feel like, go and do one,
And how have you scaled up Poppy, and what were some of the specific challenges you faced around that, and how did you go about finding mentors to help you grow the business?
A lot of the growth that came in those first few years was just that sort of like slightly mad, flying by the seat of your pants organic growth, so just flew in. And actually the challenge was much more managing that and trying not to burn out and trying to make sure others didn't burn out. Definitely those first few years, so the press we were getting and the reputation we were building and the fact that the service was so unique in such a kind of outdated sector meant that we didn't have to work that hard to grow. The way I was treating myself at the time, because I was a young person, I was ambitious and I was hungry, and that we would just kind of like say yes to everything. And I'm not sure that was the best for me or some of my colleagues. I think working with a ambitious founder can be challenging because they have this burning sense of what needs to happen, and that's very attractive, and you want to work with those people, but they're not always the most realistic people in the world. And I look back and think, I could have done with a few more, like, what are those ropes called that like tether the tent to the ground? Is that a guy rope? Could have done with some more like guy ropes, exactly. So when I think about how we scaled the business, it was not chaotic. Like it was very, very thoughtful and careful, but it was like say yes to stuff, kind of sort of deal with that later, the reality of that later. Hired some really great people from the very early days. So always focused on hiring passionate people from outside the funeral sector. Not that we would never take anyone from the sector, but an assumption that if you've come from the sector, you'd struggle to open your mind in the way that we want you to open your mind about how things could be. And always thinking ahead, I guess, like, we started off using the premises of the other funeral directors. We then, I think I've always been quite good at that. Like, what's the next thing? We're going to grow out of here. Let's assume we're going to grow out of here. Like, what's the next thing? Rather than getting to a point of having to say no. So we then moved from there to, we persuaded our local public mortuary to rent us some space. And then we moved into our beautiful headquarters in Tooting in 2015. And again, had probably had like 4 times as much space as we were going to need, that we needed at the time. Well, and also the second bit of scaling up, just because I'm completely open and won't claim to be good at everything, that I think I managed those first few years of organic growth really well. And that is precisely now why there is this senior team at Poppies that is not me, is because I think this next phase of growth that we're on right now, which is much more kind of brick by brick, it's like, it's not like work gushing through the windows. It's actually, a much more strategic path to being who we want to be in the next 5 to 10 years. I still haven't done that before. I mean, that's the irony of like setting something up, is whatever phase you're at, you haven't done it before. And to have some other people on board now who have some experience of those things is crucial. Mentors, I have quite strong feelings about mentors, because I think it's one of those, a bit like true love. It's like it's got that sense of like, I'll know them when I find them, and it'll just be this like one sort of godlike character that's going to kind of know me and love me and stand by my side and make me be all I can be. And I definitely went through some years of just like, everyone's got a mentor, I don't have a mentor, and maybe if I had a mentor I'd be much more successful. And yeah, what I've found along the way is that there are just lots of people who would love to help in small ways, often for free, if you just take the time to ask nicely and remember to say thank you and acknowledge them for their support. So I've never had one kind of wizened, silver-haired mentor, even though I would have loved the sound of that. But I think I have been quite good at recognizing the people who, when I'm with them, I come away feeling like, yep, good challenge. I'm going to go and think about that. And then more recently, we have started paying someone to come and meet with us quarterly, because we don't have a board. So she absolutely is a solid paid for mentor, but she doesn't replace all of the people who, and there are probably like tens of them who I could just message and say, can you talk to me about this thing? Or could we have an hour on this thing? I just want to dispel that idea of maybe some people do have that like one mentor that really kind of sees them through, but there probably are just like people in your community who would give you some time and you like each other and you'll just want to keep meeting for coffee every now and then.
And what is it that made you bring in a CEO in 2021, especially as the founder of the business, the person with the vision, the ambition, and, your name above the door? How hard was it to hand over the reins?
So I didn't bring a CEO. I brought in a COO, first of all. So what happened was I realised that I needed someone by my side who had some real experience of running a large organisation. I'm organised. I'm not disorganised, but I don't have that kind of like Gantt chart like brain. It started to feel like we needed those skills at Poppy's. And so ran a process. Amazing woman applied who I had seen from afar and admired from afar, called Claire Montague, and she'd been COO at Royal Trinity Hospice for 8 years. And she got the job. And I remember we'd go for these weekly walks, which we still take, and her brain was sort of racing. And I just remember feeling like, I'm so tired. Yeah. And I just kept saying to myself, it's okay. It's been a busy few years. Like, just wait till next week, just get some sleep, get some rest. And for the second time in my life, I like fully burnt out in sort of January, February of 2021. And so off the back of that, I asked Claire to move into the CEO position. So it was not a strategic. It wasn't like, Poppy's really wise, she's been planning this for months. It was absolutely like careering off the edge of a cliff and realizing like, this is the second time this has happened now. I've got 3 small children. I love this business. There's so much that we can do, but I can't do it in this role at this point in my life. And Claire is an absolute rocket of a person, and I know she would do an amazing job. Thankfully, she said yes. And so I don't know how many people, I don't know how many people are doing that stuff proactively, or for how often as founders it happens to you. But it definitely happened to me, and now I'm just so thrilled that it has.
So you were almost forced into that situation where you needed to take a step back. Claire took on the CEO role. What would be your tips on making that relationship work?
I don't feel it was forced on me. What I would say is like, my body often knows what's right for me before my head does. And as it happened, I knew it was the right thing and I felt good about it. But I still haven't figured out how to figure these things out before they happen. When it comes to tips for a good relationship, I think it's pretty much the same as any other relationship. So I think it's important to think like, why is this any different to how you would be respectful with a partner, or how is this any different to how you'd be respectful with a friend? So first things first is like, without trust, there is nothing. So I think in any relationship like that, it's very easy to start feeling like, you said this thing last week, or why did you do that? Or and Claire and I have a relationship where we just like get those things out very, very quickly and fast. And all of this has been hugely helped by the fact that when we moved, I think we did this when she moved into the CEO role, not when she began, but it was my strong feeling like we should consciously build our relationship by doing some work with a kind of third party. And so we hired this awesome man to run sessions with us every month or 6 weeks for about 6 months, which was a real consciously creating our relationship, sort of like marriage,
like couples therapy.
Yeah, like preemptive. Like, isn't that a Christian thing where you some Christian couples do a course before they get married, which is like, what do you guys think about money? How is this going to play out? And he sort of did that with us, and he'd say amazing. He'd be like, what do you both think about the word power? It was really good. I would highly recommend this, because particularly if you don't really know each other, and particularly because I'd seen her from afar and had this sense that she was wonderful, and then you're going to be working so closely together. He really taught us, I think, to lean into the idea of just being honest with each other. Sounds revolutionary. And so that's what we do. So yeah, just quickly bringing up and talking through the things that have happened that have, irritated us, or we haven't fully understood why that happened or what that meant. I strongly feel like as founder, it's my job not to get in the way. So I really take her lead on what my presence in the building should look like. And I think related to that, there's a sense of, if, again, like any relationship, like if something comes up and we disagree, like who cares the most about this thing? Like if she really cares about something and I don't care that much, then why do I need to have my way on this thing? It's just like, that's just good reciprocal behavior. And I think for me, a deep sense of like, at the end of the day, we have a joint vision for what's possible. And if either our egos get in the way of that, we won't succeed. So keeping that goal in mind, like it's not about her, it's not about me, it's about applying ourselves to achieve this thing. But we're always with this, just remembering that like as founder, you have this weird like cloak that you wear that is not like anyone else. And I think you just have to be careful about what you say and where you dig your oar in. Like if in doubt, keep it inside for a bit and stew on it a bit longer and make sure you really mean it when you say it. Something that we do religiously is we take a weekly walk. So we walk every Tuesday for like an hour and a half across Tooting Common in our welly boots, whether it's pouring with rain or snowing or blistering sunshine. And it's amazing to me how, you might think, well, we're very busy, we don't really have time for this, is this really a good use of our time? And sometimes we're not talking about work, but we might be checking in on each other's lives. And it just gives our relationship a resilience that I know when the hard times come, that's going to be worth its weight in gold.
That's such a good tip, because not only is it really good for your mental health to get outside, but it takes you away out of your workplace and into a neutral environment where you can really discuss things. So where do you dig your oar in now then? What does your role look like?
So I've worked quite hard to be really specific about the two parts of my role. So I have a founder role and I have a chair role, and they're really different. And I think that's been really helpful to me, rather than becoming this sort of amorphous opinion former, that I'm really clear about when am I being the founder and when am I being the chair. So the founder piece for me is quite a wide role. So a huge part of that role is speaking publicly about poppies. So trying to raise awareness about Great Death Care, trying to raise awareness about poppies, trying to let people know they have a choice when someone dies and that they can have a beautiful experience is massive. Claire does that work too, but I'm a big resource for the company, being able to commit myself to that. And as the storyteller and as someone who's worked as a funeral director, it's helpful to kind of have that experience. Clearly sort of setting the strategy alongside Claire. So I don't feel like I'm the lead there or she's the lead. We do that side by side. And then I think there are some founder pieces too around, again, not ever undermining other people, but there are quite a few people at Poppies who are quite senior who are new. And so they will quite often use me to sense check, particularly when it comes to tone or when it comes to kind of communications, like, is this still... So I don't know what you'd call that. It's a kind of... I guess it's kind of the... I often feel like the sort of granny, it's like, how do... we want to be aware of how we used to do things when we think about what we're doing next, because otherwise we risk not bringing the team with us or losing or undermining what we've built. So that's a bit of the founder role. And then the chair role is very much the I guess the governance piece, which is making sure that Claire is functioning as she should, and delivering as she should, making sure that we are on track to be profitable and on track to grow, and that our commitment to our environmental and social goals remains just as core to us as our desire to be a profitable business. I think that's how my role sort of plays out. But it is, and again, it just being realistic, like we're a growing business, so it is also changing all the time.
I wanted to talk to you about some of those environmental goals. I know you're on a journey to become an accredited B Corp. How has that process changed the way you're doing business?
Probably like lots of businesses, I feel like social environmental goals kind of run in our blood. And I think what's been so great about the B Corp movement is it's like, that's great, but on a good day, your commitment to your social environmental goals will remain steadfast. But when things get tight, when money gets tight, when investors come on board who maybe don't have the same values, it's very easy to kind of lose that commitment. So when we first heard about the B Corp accreditation scheme, it felt like an absolute natural fit. Like lots of small businesses, the stumbling block was just like, oh my word, it is not a light undertaking, and nor should it be. So what really got us going was a fabulous person in our team called Sarah Bax, who said, I want to be the champion and I want to drive this ahead. And she was on the front line answering the phone. You know, she was absolutely a frontline part of the team, not in a strategic role, which felt even better. So a little while ago, we kind of gave her some time in the week to start pushing that forward. And it's been such a great journey because, like lots of things, it's all very exciting at the beginning. And then you sort of start getting into the detail. It's just really hard work. You know, we're talking about weighing our waste, and we're talking about thinking really carefully about, every single tiny detail of how we run poppies. So it's been excellent. You know, the bit that felt really powerful to me was the bit where we changed our Articles of Association. So a huge part of the B Corp process is you have to change your Articles of Association so that your commitment to the environment and social good is actually like in the mission statement of the business. And there was something for me about doing that felt, I don't know, it's about safeguarding the future. You know, it's saying this isn't just like, today I feel a bit like saving the planet. You know, it's like, this is now who we are. This is who we want to become.
You're still so passionate and ambitious for the business. I know you also have 3 children and your husband runs his own business. How do you both prioritise your time?
It's really, really hard. And again, I've read so many articles, you know, of people answering this question, and I mean, lots of people are honest, but you feel like there's a good amount of conversation out there that maybe like underplays how hard it is. Yeah, our kids are almost 8, 6, and 3.5, and definitely, you know, it's a kind of like dealing with one day at a time situation. It's really, really, really hard. And I think the key for us has been just being honest with ourselves that the kids have to come first, which for the first 2 children, somehow we got away with, like, I don't know, like stuffing them in our back pockets and sort of carrying on as normal and pretending everything was fine. And definitely with the arrival of our 3rd child, that was like the bat across our backs. And we have had to reorganize things a lot to make it work. You know, lots of privilege. My husband also he's self-employed, so that means we get to split the week up. So he collects the kids a couple of days a week. I collect the kids a couple of days a week. We try to be totally equal in our responsibility for them. So we both get to do some work and also be with them. Clearly, trying to keep your marriage on track is key. You know, always saying to myself, the joke I always sort of say to him is like, you know, we could go out tonight and pay the babysitter and we feel like we don't have that money. Or we could just save that money for the divorce. You know, I've heard divorces are very expensive undertakings. So just, trying to be really, you know, just thinking in a totally different way. We didn't used to think like that, but just like, right, what does our relationship need today? What do I need today in order to be in a good enough shape tomorrow to, you know, get these kids fed and off to school? Yeah, but I do want to do a shout out to like all the parents and all the carers, because it's so hard and overlooked. And yeah, you know, we're not the first generation of people to be facing this challenge of trying to be loving parents and committed workers and, you know, good friends, etc., etc. And it's a daily challenge.
It's so often the woman's career, though, isn't it, that suffers in those situations. So it's great you're trying to make it really equal at work and at home. How do you make the relationship work? You mentioned about the weekly walks with your CEO. Do you do those with your husband as well?
Yeah, we don't do a weekly walk. We do lots of things. So we have a pretty strict rule about like phones going in the cupboard in the early evening. So we all stick our phones in a cupboard. It's not that strict, and it's not like the phones are always in the cupboard, but there is a kind of mentality which is like, I have a real thing. I'm like, I don't want to walk into a room, you know, when our time together is so short. I don't want to walk into a room and he's like on his phone, you know. I want to be like, hi. So yeah, we try and get out. I have these amazing parents that will take all 3 of my children for the weekend very occasionally. So we do get the odd weekend off. I think it's about it's all the things we already know, isn't it? It's like sometimes we'll just do the school run together, just so we can like have that 10 minutes, one walking home afterwards. I mean, it sounds a bit, but I think it is those tiny things. You know, it's like he sometimes will just be like, "Do you want to come for a coffee?" And I don't know. I've never wanted to. I mean, the date night thing, it's not really float my boat. I don't really want to go and have lasagna, and I'm too tired. But just a cup of tea, you know, just those little moments, I think, and just remembering that. I think these are the hardest years. We've been together for 20 years, and I think these are the hardest years we've faced in terms of stretch. And so, I don't know what the next 10 years will be like, but just fingers crossed it'll ease up at some point.
And what are the next 10 years going to be like for Poppies? What's next for you?
So our ambitions for Poppies are to triple the number of people we serve over the next 3 years. So that's very ambitious. So we look after about 350 families a year across Greater London, and we're looking to triple that. And longer term, our ambition is to be the kind of logical, independent choice for kind of people who were thinking consciously about who they'd want to use. So we believe we could get to looking after like 5% of people in Greater London, which would be amazing. So the point of that is because whilst we stay in this position we're in right now, which is like we have this amazing reputation and we're providing this beautiful service, but we're very much used by people kind of in the know, and it's horrifying that 10 years later you still look in the newspapers and there's the same stories, you know, the dead being cared for poorly, people being sold things they don't want or need, and a growing sense as we understand more about our impact on the planet, as well as, you know, a sector that doesn't really show much interest in modernizing in order to support people to make better choices for the planet. So it's very exciting. So the idea is to be serving a solid number of people in Greater London, and I guess beyond that, the question would be like, where next? If we could get to that point.
Poppy, best of luck with the expansion of the business. I think you're making such a difference, not just to individual grieving families, but to the industry as a whole. Thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Thanks so much for having me.
You can find out more about Poppies on LinkedIn or on Instagram at Poppies Funerals. I hope everyone has enjoyed this episode. We'd love to know what you think, so please leave us a review. And don't forget to subscribe for more raw and honest stories from Sound Advice Entrepreneurs Unfiltered.